Hello, this will be a presentation about the sexual education in Utah, and it will also include a brief history of sexual education history in the United States. So let's begin. In Utah, sexual education is taught 3 times throughout the education process. The first time is maturation in 5th grade, around 10 and 11-year-olds. Then again in Health 1 and Health 2 in middle school and or junior high school, and high school again there. So maturation, this is basically focusing on what happens during puberty. They usually have a separate male and female presentation, about an hour or two long. They have a guest speaker. They show them a pre-approved video and then talk about it, answer any questions, and so on. Parent permission is required for the student to be able to view this. Then in Health 1, it gets upgraded to an entire sex ed unit where they focus on autonomy, emotional, and social aspects of it in kind of this triangle approach. 85% of Utah high schools reported that they did this with an abstinence focus. Again, they often have guest speakers to talk on certain subjects, and parents' permission is again required. And then we have Health 2. This is basically just a expounded upon version of the Health 1 version in high school. We have it as its own unit again. We go in depth about the autonomy of human genitalia and processes and stuff like that. They talk about healthy relationships, peer pressure avoidance, alcohol, parties, all that stuff. Again, a great deal of abstinence only focus here. Guest speakers come in again, and for this one, parent permission is still required to learn this stuff. Right here we have the Utah law on how sexual education is to be taught. We have a list here of things that ought to be included in. The state board shall make rules that in an instruction that stresses the importance of abstinence from all sexual activity before marriage and fidelity after marriage as methods of preventing certain communicable diseases. They stress personal skills that encourage individual choice of abstinence and fidelity. There's some things that are prohibited, and they're allowed to include information about contraceptive methods or devices that stress the effectiveness, limitations, risk, and information on state law applicable to minors obtaining contraceptive methods or devices, of course, except provided in subsection 2D down here at the bottom. If you can see that, they do not require it to be taught or adopt instructional materials that include information on contraceptive methods or devices. Now, law can be a little thick, so I can clarify that down for you. So basically, we have these are the current requirements to be taught in Utah sexual education classes, either in Health 1 or Health 2. The community and personal health, the psychology of it, personal hygiene, telling kids to wear deodorant more or less and wash their private parts, prevention of communicable diseases, HIV, AIDS, stuff like that, refusal skills, how to say no, and harmful effects of pornography. And then what isn't allowed to be taught is intercourse, any premarital or extramarital sexual activities, any advocacy for contraceptives isn't allowed, but the objective effectiveness of them is allowed, but not required. And any information on anything illegal, yeah, you can't go up there and tell children how to commit crimes. It's just not allowed. Okay, so now let's switch tracks here for a moment and talk about the history of sexual education in the United States. We'll get back to the Utah policy and how they handle it here in a bit. So the start of sexual education was believed to start in the early 1900s or even possibly in the 1890s, with this focus on reducing STIs and to teach sexual morality. At the time, STIs were called venereal disease, and what they're talking about sexual morality is just some people thought there was too many prostitutes in the street. Now we refer to them as sex workers. They had this idea of social hygiene and to have this kind of moral high ground in sexual times. Around this time in like 1914, the American Sexual Health Association got established, though at the time it was referred to as the American Social Hygiene Association, which meant that they got to keep their letters, the ASHA. Now, sexual education in the United States didn't really start taking off until World War One, because during World War One, 40% of drafted soldiers had venereal disease, STIs, which first had to be addressed and treated before they could go out into combat. So we got this Chamberlain Act, which was the first case of government spending on sexual education, which provided $4 million from the educational year 1990 to 1920 to teach teachers how to teach students how to avoid sexually transmitted infections. Then throughout the 1920s, we have this more scandalous time, like flapper culture and stuff like that. But instead of addressing that, the sexual education stayed purely biological. It wasn't until the 40s and 50s that they started to address more social aspects of sexual education. The American Association of School Administrators explained it in this way in 1938. Students have been taught the names, functions, and physical disorders of the various sex organs, but that is a minor contribution to the great problems of affection, courtship, and marriage in modern society. Most of the conflicts that keep youth awake in troubled nights are psychological and social problems. So in this period, we have things like the Human Growth film in 1948. This was an educational animated film that was basically what you'd see in a maturation program explaining to children the changes their body will go through. It was provided by this family life education group here. They were responsible for a lot of the films in the 1940s and the 1950s that were kind of instructional guides to how to live within the American culture. If you've ever played a Fallout game, they actually make fun of this kind of format of educational videos and use it as the tutorial videos. And that's kind of what it was. It was tutorial videos on how to live here in the United States. So that was all good and dandy. So here in 1964, the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States, or SICUS, came to being. A big shout out to them. A lot of the information that I'm using for this slide and research came from their pamphlets and information that they researched. So thank you a lot. So one of the first, one big notable thing that happened around in the 60s was this Grindswald versus Connecticut opinion, which overturned some Comstock laws about owning contraceptives. See, the Comstock laws were created in 1873, and it forbid any obscene material from being sent through the mail or sold, and it applied to contraceptives at the time. Now, the ruling in this court case was that it was unconstitutional to prevent married couples from having access to contraceptives, as it was a right of privacy and personal choice. It's worth noting that it took 7 years for another Supreme Court ruling to come out that allowed unmarried couple the right to possess contraceptives. Before these rulings in 65 and 72, it was a misdemeanor to have it. That's right. It's only been 50 years since it's been legal for single people to have contraceptives. Now, in the 1970s, there kind of came this culture wars um, with a lot of more progressive things happening at the time. Uh, you saw the invention of birth control here at the start of the 1970s, and the famous Roe v. Wade decision that gave these two things played a big role in giving reproductive freedom to women and the ability to plan families and invest in their careers. And it changed the way many people in society viewed premarital sex, relationships, and even marriage itself. Um, to compare how big the early 70s were, a 1969 poll found that 70% of Americans were opposed to premarital sex, but another poll in 1973 found that that was down to 50%. Other things between these two polls were that fewer people were offended by nudity in magazines and plays. It went down from three-quarters to just over half. Uh, the percentage of people who were offended by topless waitresses went down by 17%, and the people who thought everyone who wanted birth control should have access to it went up by 10 points. Slowly throughout the 70s, it was clear that this was becoming the new norm for society as a whole. Um, but you had this big group known as the Christian right that was against this and still held beliefs of social purity and more conservative and by the Bible views on human relationships and marriage and heterosexuality and so on and so forth. One of their biggest accomplishments was introducing abstinence only education funding in 1981. Under the AFLA, the Adolescence and Family Life Act, which is what gave them the abstinence funding. Now, up until this point, the conversation was about whether or not schools should even teach sexual education, or maybe it's just up to the parents. But that changed with AIDS. So the Reagan administration ignored AIDS because it was seen as a primarily gay disease. So it was not addressed until 1985, even though it was known all the way back in 1982. And then from there, they started to put focus on researching AIDS and STDs and trying to find a cure. But until a cure could be found, they figured that the only way and the only tool they had to combat this was education. So by 1990, all 50 states required education on HIV and AIDS avoidance and prevention, though only 42 states had any sexual education in the curriculum. So it was totally possible to learn about AIDS and STDs and nothing else about sexual education in this interesting time. This was also when the Center for Disease Control and Prevention became a big influencer in the sexual education curriculum, because they were trying to limit AIDS and STDs. This was in 1988. Now, from 1990 to the present, this became very, very politically heated, where you have the two groups of having this great debate between comprehensive and abstinence-only education. Comprehensive is everything is being taught to them, from contraceptives to relationships to refusal skills to alcohol and drugs effects on sexual relations, all of it, etc., etc. And abstinence only is teaching that the only way to avoid any STDs and the only right way to go about life is to just wait until after marriage. But the big question here was, which one of these methods reduced risk-taking behaviors more? And In 1990s, we saw the first guidelines for what comprehensive sexual education actually encompasses. We even had officials talking about it. Here's a quote from Dr. M. Jocelyn Elders from New York Times in 1994. She said, "Everyone in the world is opposed to sex outside of marriage, and yet everyone does it. I'm saying get real. Our kids already know we're not real. People realize that we all support the moral view, but we all know that an awful lot of children are not being abstinent. Since we can't legislate morals, we have to teach them how to take care of themselves." End quote. This was a very controversial take at the time, and she got a lot of backlash for it. Now, the Christian Right organization continued pushing this abstinence only until marriage program as a way to put morality and family values back in sexual education, similar to the sexual purity and social purity uh, way back at the start of the 20th century. But this approach garnished the most support from federal government in the years of 1990 to 2010. And it can be seen here in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Act, which had a Title V subsection to it about funding schools and educations, but only if they taught abstinence-only education. Now, these had very strict definitions to be eligible for funding, so most of the programs actually relied on fear and shame to control young people's behaviors, suggesting that STDs were inevitable, and teens who had sex before marriage were less worthy of love and respect. Kind of this scare them off of ever doing anything and having love and stuff like that. This wasn't the only form of funding provided straight from the federal government to this. In 2000, we had the community-based abstinence education program, which bypassed the states and went directly towards individual privately owned organizations that spewed this abstinence propaganda. They had a 113 million yearly funding in their height in 2006 and through 2008, and it was taught with a lot of religious undertones. This is where the narrative that boys will be boys and girls must keep them in control came from, with quotes from the student textbooks that they made during these times, with things like, "Watch what you wear. If you don't aim to please, don't aim to tease." 2001 student textbook. It is worth noting that this funding was discontinued, I do believe, in 2014. I can't remember exactly, but that's no longer around, thank goodness. In 2007, they did a lot of studies to try and find once and for all, which one of these approaches were more effective. And what they found was that abstinence-only programs did little to change behavior and were believed to be more damaging, as they were no more likely to abstain from sex between the same age. They were less likely to use condoms and practice safer sex than people that got no education and didn't take these chastity pledges. So the risk, in this case, the risk-taking behaviors were estimated to be roughly the same between these two, but comprehensive education saw them practicing safer sex when they did do it. Of course, there's been more studies on both sides of this argument that have questionable funding on whether or not they were politically charged or not, and have very selective views. So it is really easy to make an argument for the other way through this data, which makes studying stuff really, really difficult when even the peer-reviewed studies are clashing against each other. Um, but this saw a great shift in the climate after these 2007 studies came out. Um, that the people started to prefer evidence-based comprehensive sexual education programs more so than the old abstinence-only ones. And so in 2010, they got funding for the first time under the Obama administration for these evidence-based programs. But this kind of back and forth between these two versions of sexual education is still evidence today. This is important because if you can control what is being taught, you can control the narrative and other aspects of a society. Yeah. Okay, so at this point, I bet you're wondering, what is comprehensive sex education? Um, well, the CDC came up with 20 aspects of comprehensive sex education, and I'm going to go through 10 of those here today. These are the exact wording taken straight from them, so let's go through them all. We got how to create and sustain healthy and respectful relationships, preventative care that's necessary to maintain reproductive and sexual health, influences of families, peers, media, technology, and other factors on sexual risk behavior, the use of interpersonal communication skills to avoid or reduce sexual risk behaviors, and the relationship between alcohol and other drugs use and the sexual behaviors. How to access valid and reliable information, product, and services related to HIV and STDs in pregnancy, how HIV and other STDs are transmitted. This was their primary reason for the CDC becoming involved, as we talked about earlier. How to correctly use condoms, importance of using condoms consistently and correctly, methods of contraceptives other than condoms. So I took some data from those 10 out of 20 sexual topics in their 2018 study. I have it separated from Health 1, junior high school 8th graders, and Health 2, the high schoolers and 10th graders. And yeah, you can just kind of see the differences in percentages. Yeah. Some things worth noting is HIV and STD transmission, healthy relationships, abstinence, communication and negotiation. These are all things that are like required under the current curriculum. They're not 100%. They probably should be higher, like 95%, but you know, still good. Other things to note, how to use a condom is the lowest percentage out of all of these in all 20, with none of the 73 Utah schools surveyed in the sample reporting that they taught it in their junior highs, and only 9% in high school, even though the importance of condom use is a higher percentage. So they're being taught that it's important to use a condom, but not how to use a condom. And we have some contraceptives other than condom here. I think this higher percentage might be talking about birth control pills and maybe the importance of that has in current society and its effect on regulating hormones, but that's speculation. But as far as Utah being comprehensive in sexual education, primarily due to the contraceptives here, only 3.9% of Utah high schools surveyed, so like 4 or 5, reported being comprehensive. None of the junior highs. So yeah. Now, what they teach is only one aspect of measuring the quality of sexual education. Here we have the average in all of the United States on these different um, programs that are available to high schoolers and junior high schools. These aren't actually programs that they provide on site. These are just the percentages that refer the students their to these programs. I bet you are all wondering where Utah stands in all this. I am too, because Utah was the only state in this survey that didn't have data on these points, though I'm willing to bet that it is low. So the question is, why is Utah like this in regards to sexual education? Well, the two biggest reasons I believe and are easy to see is that we're a red state. We have Republican senators Mike Lee and Mitt Romney. We also have the former Orrin Hatch senator. He was a senator for over 40 years here in Utah and actually holds the longest Republican senator in all of United States history. Um, and so what these people believe and what they teach have and will continue to have a huge effect on the law and what we learn in education. All these people are also members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints. Most people know them as Mormons. And this is because if you know Utah history, we were kind of founded by Mormon pioneers that kind of believed and founded this, and so we became this cultural religious center where today I believe it was like 40% of people that live in Utah are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which isn't the majority, but just like the Christian right, the religious populations tend to vote more and have more political activism and believe in voting and political activism for changing society and stuff like that. So because of these cultural aspects, it changes every part of the law and how our culture is. Um, in the religion, they have what's known as their law of chastity, where the individuals are expected to refrain from any sexual activities until after marriage. Now, I couldn't find it being stated anywhere, but there's this cultural expectation that we refrain from any form of masturbation or self-exploration or watching pornography on top of waiting until after marriage to have sex. But it is highly encouraged after marriage, so that's fun. Also, Utah's like one of the only, if not the only state to have declared a war on porn. If you remember from the law slide earlier in this presentation, one of the required things for the schools to teach was the harmful effects of pornography. This was actually added in 2016. And just kind of shows how Utah be, you know? Remember Title 5 from a few slides back? Yeah, Utah is one of the states that benefits from the funding of this title. From the webpage, I found this kind of mission statement that the purpose of the Title V State Sexual Risk Avoidant Education Grants program is to fund states and territories to implement education exclusively on sexual risk avoidance that teaches youths to voluntarily refrain from sexual activity. Underlined exclusively and voluntary refrain from sexual activity to show that sexual risk avoidant education is just abstinence only under a different name. Utah received a grant for from October 1st, 2020 to September 30th, 2022 for roughly $500,000 to be used in education of abstinence-only programs, which isn't a lot compared to some of the other states, but where we spend our money and where we get our money is a big revealer of the things that we value and believe politically. Here in Utah, last year we had House Bill 177, which would have had added health education to include instruction on consent, coercion, sexual violence behavior, deterrence education, and sexual assault mitigation strategies to that law that we looked at earlier, and it just didn't pass, which is why I decided to do this whole presentation to begin with. Now, the best reason I could find for why it didn't pass was this slippery slope argument that if it did pass, more proactive laws might have been passed in the future that would have made us more promiscuous and less socially hygienic and going against the will of the senators and representatives. And just the fact that this didn't pass shows that as a state, we're kind of stuck where we are in regards to sexual education. So, why is all of this so important? Education is important for the proper sexual development of adolescents. People have a right to accurate, appropriate information, including that of sexual education. This information would allow adolescents to make informed sexual choices as opposed to letting one thing lead to another without a plan of contraceptive and safe sex practices. And they need to have all this information so they can make these informed sexual choices. In modern days, social media and online influences have become very big, and I don't think proper legislation has taken these aspects into account yet. Social media and online influence put children in more danger of being sexually harassed online, and they're asked to do like revealing things as minors, and they get sexually manipulated, and predators prey on them and meet up with them. They get groomed online, even if it doesn't end in them getting abducted. They can still get scarred from the experience, or even believe that they have like responsibilities to put out in sex. And I think social media is more harmful than even pornography on the development of children, adolescents, on their future in the regards to sexual education. And it's really telling that Bill 177 didn't get passed, because it could have helped educate, if passed, on all of these skills to avoid these harmful, and what to do if they were ever put into these situations on social media and the like. Not only that, other online influences, like being able to look up information that might be falsy or have a politically charged narrative that could be harmful to the individual. We have this average age of which children first see porn is way lower than it used to be. Right now, it's estimated at 13.37 average age for the first time. This comes from a 2017 study that had people report as young as 5 years old and as old as 20 as the first time that they saw pornography. The actual average is still highly debated. I've seen it as low as like 11 and as high as like 16. But this is a problem, because they see all this information without any context, and this can lead to unsafe sex, believing that their partner would like whatever's going on in these extreme videos. And yeah, it's better to teach important things like this as parents or teachers and not have them find out this way. Um, but yeah, in Utah at least, every single time sexual education is taught, it requires a parent signature. So if the individual parents are against their children learning these sexual health education things, they can choose to give their child an exemption from it. So I think the moral thing to do would be to make this education as comprehensive and teach them everything that they need to do, and then let the parents decide whether or not they want their students to learn these things. You could always make the counter argument that teaching children as a whole these informations would make it so that the people that don't go can still learn it from their peers, and it just changes the culture and all that stuff. But um, I think cost benefit analysis is just better for students and society as a whole if they learned more comprehensive things. It's their right as individuals to get this information. It helps them with their development, make informed choices, and be safer online. And for all those reasons, I think this is really important. Sex is a part of total health. It doesn't belong to the church. It doesn't belong to the law. It belongs to you, person. And that's what it all boils down to, because we really can't and probably shouldn't make laws about individual moral choices in regards to these things. But what we can do is give them education required to make their own choices. Teach them what's illegal, teach them the risks and the benefits of having premarital, postmarital, or any sex in general and relationships, and just have open discussions about these issues, because this is one of the biggest social issues out there, and it has prevalence in so many different other social areas. It's wild. And it's sadly, I think, of all the big ones, it's the one that's least talked about because of these stigmas and the moral high grounds that people attribute to it. Only when we can openly and honestly talk about sexual education as a society do I believe things can get better. That's all I got for today. Big shout out to all the information and the people out there doing these studies. I'd like to thank Psychus again. A lot of this information and quotes came directly from some of their resources and information. Like in case you're wondering where my biases lie, yeah, I'm all for comprehensive sexual education. I lived all of my education life here in Utah, so I know a thing or two about Utah education. I'm 20 years old, currently a college student at SLCC. Yeah, and that can totally change my perspective on things. Oh, I'll probably mention information that I got from many, many more sites, but these are the big ones. I didn't want my citation page to be like 50 things long because I might have mentioned something from one of those. So, yeah,